My name is Rasoul, PhD student at the University of Waterloo, and I'm going to be talking about our work on PIR. So this was a work that I did as part of my work at Google when I was a student researcher, and this was joint work with my colleagues Savar Patel, Junyoung Seo, and Kevin Yao. And luckily, we got accepted into S&P last month, and I put in the link for the paper on ePrint as well. So with that, I'll get started. But first, I just want to remind that last year, at about June of last year, at a meetup just like this one, Craig Gentry was giving a talk about FHE and the history of FHE. And in one of the slides, he said that one of the sweet spots for FHE, especially these days, is probably PIR. So with that prelude, we'll be talking about PIR today. So what is PIR for those who aren't familiar? In a private information retrieval or PIR protocol, you have a client which wants to retrieve a record from a database such that the server does not learn which record has been retrieved. And there have been a lot of applications for PIR in recent years. So an earlier one that many people might be familiar with is the application called Password Checkup, which allows a client to check if one of their passwords has been in a database of leaked passwords. And this is a feature that's now implemented in a lot of browsers like Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge. A more recent application that was done by Apple is Private Image Search, which allows users to check or cross-reference some of their images with a database of landmarks that Apple has curated. And under the hood, to do this check, Apple uses a combination of private information retrieval and homomorphic encryption to do that. Another application is in the context of certificate transparency, and it was shown that you could use PIR to perform an audit of the SCT logs, where clients using their authentic browsing history can check the logs to check that the certificates that they have seen are actually valid and were correctly issued. Another application that we discussed this year at S&P was was in the context of distributed networks and using PIR in that context, particularly in the context of IPFS. In IPFS, you have a bunch of content that is distributed across the network, and each server is holding some amount of this content. And when someone wants to retrieve a piece of content, they start going around the network asking to see who holds that content. And throughout this routing process, and until all the way up to the point where they want to retrieve the file, they keep telling people, "Oh, this is the file I'm looking for." So they're revealing the query that they want to be able to access that file. And we showed how you can replace all of the queries that are made in that distributed file system with PIR queries. And we kind of showed the associated overheads if you were to use PIR. And then the last application, another one from Google, is in the context of device enrollment. So every time you purchase a Chromebook, and when you open it up, the device needs to fetch some information from the server to start to do the startup process. And that information can be fetched privately using something like PIR. And that was something that was also done at Google in recent years. So there's luckily no shortage of applications of PIR, and these PIR protocols that are used and deployed in practice rely on homomorphic encryption in some form. And this could go back to protocols as early as SealPIR and MalPIR, all the way up to the more recent protocols like hintless PIR, simple PIR, and YPIR. And all of these use some form of homomorphic encryption based on LW or RLW under the hood. There are some PIR constructions from some other tools and other assumptions, but those are not the topic of this talk, and they aren't particularly practical for the use cases that we talked about. So we won't be talking about those today. But the thing is, even these efficient PIR protocols based on homomorphic encryption have some subtle underlying assumptions that make them hard to use in practice. So what could this look like? For example, two very common assumptions that are made when designing PIR protocols is, first, that the client and server have a pre-established connection, which essentially means that you have access to this like offline phase where you can exchange information. And this is, for example, exchanging the cryptographic keys that we're familiar with when using FHE. So you send like an evaluation key or maybe bootstrapping key, for example, in the offline phase, and you assume that that has been done, the server will be holding that, and there's this long-term connection between this client and the server. The other assumption is that you can amortize costs. So you assume the client will be making many queries, and then that means that, okay, even though I paid this high upfront cost to send the evaluation keys, that cost will be amortized over the lifetime of the connection between the client and the server. And you can think of many cases where that won't hold, even in the examples and applications that I mentioned. For example, you might have a client just making one query, which was the case in our distributed file system, where each PIR query that the client was making was to a different server. So each server was only responding to a singular query from that client. And the other example is like a cold start, which was the case for the Chromebook example, where the laptop has just been opened up. It's going to start. It's going to do the startup process. So there literally has been no time to perform an offline phase between the client and the server. And you can think of other examples as well where these assumptions will generally not hold. A good example of this is an interesting demo that was made a few years back by some researchers in PIR, Samir, and this was for a private Wikipedia. So the name implies what it does. It privately fetches a Wikipedia page using homomorphic encryption in PIR. And the issue is, if you see this video, is that initial setup cost that I mentioned. So if you see that once you go to actually search for something, it'll happen. There you go. It starts uploading the setup data, and the setup data in this case is the homomorphic keys. And you can see that it'll take quite a while for it to upload those cryptographic keys. But this will only happen once, because you only need the client to upload their keys once before making all the subsequent queries. But you can see that they say in their description that they'll be uploading 18 megabytes of data just before issuing the first query. So which should be a lot if you're only making one query. And they should be finished in a second. There, the setup keys were uploaded. Now it can fetch the article relatively quickly, and any new articles that you fetch after this will be fast, but you saw that the initial setup cost was high. So this is just to put into context, okay, what is this problem that we were solving? Like this would have been a big problem if this was the only query that we wanted to make. So, okay. So with that context, we're going to be putting our focus on PIR with what we call server-side preprocessing. So in this paradigm, instead of relying on, so we won't be relying on long-term cryptographic keys the way we usually do in homomorphic encryption. The other thing we won't be doing, which is common in the PIR literature, is exchanging a database-dependent hint, where this server sends something like a digest of the database to the client, and then the client can use that to issue its PIR queries. And we'll only be relying on server-side preprocessing to make our PIR protocol faster and more communication efficient. Okay, so with that introduction, I'll go now on to explain the trade-offs between this paradigm that we're working in and the other works. And then I'll go into our construction, a little bit of background, the overall blueprint, and then the specific new tools that we introduce, the ring packing with preprocessing and homomorphic polynomial evaluation, and I'll put it together in the final protocol, which we call InsPIRe, and I'll end with some evaluation of our work. So what trade-off do we get? What's the trade-off when using this paradigm that we're proposing? So first of all, on the one end, you have the long-term keys approach that I mentioned, which with works like CLPIR and MulPIR and Spiral. So again, they have to store that long-term key for each client. The server has to store that long-term key for each client that it wants to interact with. And even though that is happening, the speed of this approach still is not very high, with a throughput of only a few hundreds of megabytes per second. But the advantage is that once that long-term key is uploaded and the connection is established, you can have a very small communication cost per query for issuing PIR queries. On the other end is, like I said, the database, the approaches which send a database-dependent hint, like simple PIR and double PIR. So the disadvantage is the fact that you have to send that large hint. But the speed of these PIR protocols could be very fast, up to tens of gigabytes per second of speed, which is pretty very good for amongst the PIR literature. And you still maintain that small communication cost per query in these approaches as well. So in the third paradigm, which is what we'll be working in, and there's works like InsPIRe and YPIR in this paradigm as well, we won't be relying on any sort of offline communication between the client and the server. The existing work achieves pretty good speed, between 1 to 10 gigabytes per second of throughput. But the problem ends up being the pretty high communication cost per query that you have to pay. So in our work, we're going to be trying to address these three problems at the same time. We're going to try to be relatively fast while having a lower communication cost per query, while only relying on server-side preprocessing. So I'll skip most of the background because I think it's the FHE community will mostly know about the structure of LW and RLW ciphertext. But the big new thing that might be new for an FHE audience is what we call the CRS model that was also proposed in previous work. So usually the way you work with LWE and RLWE ciphertext is that you generate a new mask, so the A component of a ciphertext, either in the LW or RLW ciphertext. The A component is generated fresh with every new ciphertext you want to generate. So in the CRS model, we assume that the A is going to be the same for all clients, and this gives us the opportunity to do pre-processing on that component. So the caveat is that you have to use a fresh key every time you want to generate a ciphertext, because you can't reuse the same A without rotating your key. Okay, so so the red in this slide, and then all the subsequent slides as well, will note these components that are going to be the same for all clients, and the blue is the parts that will be dependent on the client's input, so that will be generated as part of the query. But so all the red parts will be able to perform pre-processing on. Okay, so now we can start getting into the blueprint of the PIR protocol, and the starting point is PIR from LWE, which was the approach first proposed in simple PIR. So we start off by representing the database as this matrix D0 by D1 matrix, and we perform an inner product between the database and an encrypted vector of LWE ciphertext, and an encrypted indicator vector, which is this middle rectangle over here. And once you do this multiplication, what you get is the encryption of one of the columns of the database, but encrypted under LWE. So the problem is, if you just send this back as is, the response size will be very large because it's a whole vector of LWE ciphertext. So the next step after that, the next step after that is performing LWE to RLWE packing. So I guess ring packing is what I just described, taking a vector of LWE ciphertext and packing them into one RLWE ciphertext. And the different PIR protocols like InsPIRe and YPIR kind of differ in the approach they take to this packing step. So for example, in the case of InsPIRe, they use a custom packing protocol that has somewhat smaller packing keys, only 300 kilobytes, but the size of the packed output is somewhat larger. And in the case of YPIR, they use a different packing procedure that existed in the literature that has larger packing keys, about 480 kilobytes, but can produce a more packed output. So as you can see, the two metrics that we care about here are, first of all, the packing key sizes, because those are the things that need to be sent over the network, and then the size of the output as well, because we want to, again, make the output as packed as possible to reduce the communication costs. So we're going to try to propose a different type of packing that can be better on both of those specific metrics, like having both smaller packing keys while also producing a somewhat packed output. So now I'll dive into our first construction, which we call inspiring, which is a ring packing procedure that focuses on pre-processing. So inspiring will work in 3 general steps. So in the first step, we start off with a vector of with a vector of LWE ciphertext, and we just start by interpreting these LWE ciphertexts as RLWE ciphertexts. So the problem is that this will embed the message from the LWE ciphertext in the constant coefficient of the RLWE ciphertext, but all of the other coefficients will be like random garbage that we don't care about. So we need to clear out the other coefficients. And there we use this lemma, which essentially says that if you compute this particular sum of permutations of a polynomial over the negative cyclic ring, all of the coefficients will cancel out and you'll only be left with the constant coefficient. So because this function q of x only uses automorphisms and additions, we can easily do that homomorphically. But the problem is we want to kind of do it a little bit differently and not perform the necessary key switchings that are required when you're doing automorphisms. So the consequence of this is that we'll end up with ciphertexts that are in this intermediate representation that, as you know, when you do a key switching, when you do an automorphism, it introduces an additional secret key term that if you don't get rid of, you'll have to kind of work with that. And that's what's happening here. So after performing this or computing this lemma homomorphically, we'll end up with a ciphertext that has not just one, but d terms as the mask. So we have a ciphertext in this intermediate representation that we'll be working with. Okay, so once we have the ciphertext in the intermediate representation, the second step is kind of combining them, because right now the LWE or the original LWE messages are all in separate ciphertexts. So now we need to aggregate them into one. And here we just do the thing that is done in other protocols too, which is just like multiplying and adding them together so that the different messages can land in the coefficients of a ciphertext. So once we do that, we now have one ciphertext that is in the intermediate representation that holds all of the original messages from the LWE ciphertext that we started with. So the last step is, okay, now we just need to go back to the original LWE format because we don't want to stay in this intermediate representation. So right now the only problem is we just need to essentially key switch from this intermediate representation back to the original LWE format. But if we did this naively, we would need a lot of keys to perform all of the necessary key switchings. So here we're going to show how to use only 2 keys to perform all of the necessary key switchings to go from the intermediate representation back to the original RLWE format. So I'll explain how to use one key, and then the second key will kind of follow. And one thing to remind is, so first of all, the one key switching key that we will use has this like specific format. But the important thing to know is that the key switching key itself is again a ciphertext. So we will obey the same rule that we mentioned before in the CRS model, meaning that we will have a fixed A component for all clients, and only the B component will be generated by the client based on their input. So now using this one key, we're going to iteratively collapse that huge intermediate representation back to the original RLWE format. So what does that look like? Let's say we start off with this ciphertext R of X, which has, again, a lot of A components. And I've written the corresponding S component, the corresponding secret key component on top of each A term. So the way to start collapsing this is you take the last A component, and by using the key switching key that you were provided, you collapse that last term onto the term before it, in a way representing the last secret key component in terms of the secret key component before it. And this lets you get rid of one of the A components that you had, essentially getting rid of one of the secret key terms that you relied on. So you can actually keep on doing this because the relationship between each 2 of these terms is like this constant. So you can keep doing this iteratively until all of the A components that you weren't interested in have been removed, and you're only left with the one secret key component that is the original secret key up here. So a few things to note here. First of all of the red components, which are, like I said, known in the offline phase, can be done offline, so that won't have an impact on the online runtime when you're responding to, for example, a PIR query. And only the blue parts have to be done online. And we showed that how these online parts end up being really fast, only in the form of some fast point-wise vector operations. The other thing to note is that I showed here how to use one key, but this procedure only gets you down to 2 A components. So at the end, you'll need one other key to convert those two A components back to each other, back into one. So yeah. Okay, so that is, in summary, is the 3 steps of inspiring. And the insights from this new packing procedure is, first of all, the lemma and the fact that we use this lazy key switching process that allows us to use only 2 keys instead of the usual log of D keys that are required. And it also shows the value of working in this intermediate representation when working with homomorphic ciphertexts. Which essentially, in this case, represents an MLWE ciphertext, which is what's usually used in the FHE literature. So, and then just again to summarize, the advantages of this will be the fact that we can use only 2 keys to perform the packing procedure, the very fast online phase we get because of the pointwise vector operations, and the fact that we also get slightly less noise growth because of the way we do our procedure. The last thing is that you can have a variant of inspiring, which allows you to do not full packing, but packing up to some amount less than the full size of the RLW ciphertext. So we show how you can do this variant in the paper, and we show some PIR protocols based on that one as well. Okay, so going back to the original motivation, which was PIR. So if we swap the packing procedure in the existing literature with inspiring, this gives us a first of all, in terms of the numbers, we can see that the packing keys could be up to 5 times smaller than those existing in the literature, while obtaining just as packed of an output as something like YPIR does. So this already gives us a pretty good PIR protocol. But we're not done here yet. So the problem is that you still have to send back a lot of RLWE ciphertext. For example, in this case, we call it T. And this could be bad if you don't want to retrieve such a large payload from the database. So we're going to try to kind of collapse the database, or collapse this response again in kind of like a second layer of PIR. So the approaches for that could be using another indicator vector for this second layer of PIR. But the problem is that if you want to resort to an indicator vector, you would probably have to send, you either have to send one ciphertext for each a bit of the indicator vector that you generate for this second layer of PIR, which will then be a lot of ciphertext, which will increase the communication costs again. You could send a packed indicator vector, but then you would need to send some unpacking keys, which would again increase the communication costs. So instead of taking these existing approaches, we're going to use what we call homomorphic polynomial evaluation for this second step of PIR. So to kind of again summarize the objective here, we have T RLWE polynomials, y0 to yt minus 1, and we want to choose homomorphically between one of these T polynomials. And we do this by representing this objective as a polynomial evaluation. So just meaning that we need to find some fixed point zi such that at the point zi, if you evaluate the polynomial, you will get the point yi. Just to kind of clarify, here we're kind of working with the points being the ring. So this polynomial q that we're evaluating is kind of like a multivariate polynomial. Okay, so with this, so now let's assume for a second that we actually have this multivariate polynomial q that we want to evaluate. If we have it, all we need to now do is homomorphically do the evaluation, and to make the evaluation efficient and produce bound the noise that is accumulated during this evaluation, we evaluate the polynomial using Horner's method, and this also allows us to perform the multiplications in the homomorphic polynomial evaluation using external products, external RGSW to RLW external products, which will limit the noise growth. But in terms of communication costs, all we'll actually need then is only the encryption of Z under RGSW. So you won't need like other encryptions, like encryptions of powers of Z or anything like that. Okay. So the only leap of faith we took here was the fact that we assumed Q existed, and we still need to find Q. But that could be non-trivial because we are working over a ring. The points that we're talking about are in a ring. So it's not trivial that you can actually interpolate over these points in a ring. So that's the question we need to answer next. Okay, how can I choose some ZIs such that the existence of Q is, like, we can ensure that Q exists? But also, because of the fact that we're doing external products, external RGSW to RLW external products, we prefer the points to be low norm so that the noise growth of the external product will be bounded. So the question is, are there some set of ZIs that achieve both of these constraints at the same time? And the answer to that is also yes. So if you choose the T roots of unity in the ring, which take the form of monomials with norm 1 plus or minus x to the I, then these roots of unity you can interpolate over them, and their norm is also small because it's only 1. So the interpolation comes from an old result in linear algebra, which says that if you want to interpolate over some elements in a ring, you can do that interpolation if the points you're interpolating over are the roots of unity. And then the low norm, like I said, is also clear because of the fact that the monomials have norm only 1. So this results in only an additive noise growth for each multiplication as we're doing the homomorphic polynomial evaluation. Okay, so now that's for the homomorphic polynomial evaluation, and now we have all of the pieces to discuss InsPIRe, the final PIR protocol. So we'll start from here. We start from a database of n polynomials. So each of these disks will be a polynomial, and we structure these n polynomials in a table of t rows and n over t columns. So the first step we do is, over each of these columns, we perform the homomorphic, the polynomial interpolation. So we interpolate a polynomial for each of these columns, giving us n over t interpolated polynomials. But the coefficients are, again, just normal RLW polynomials. So now this can be treated as our new database. So we encode this into the constituent bits and back into the original matrix that we wanted to work with. And then we do the PIR protocol as we did before. We do the inner product between the database and the encrypted indicator vector, which gives us one of the columns. And then we do the LWE to RLWE packing, which will again give us a bunch of RLWE ciphertexts. Now, just to kind of show under the hood, these RLWE ciphertexts that we have at the end are actually just encryptions of one of the interpolated polynomials that we had in this encoded database. So with that, we can now do the homomorphic polynomial evaluation given the encryption, the RGSW encryption of a point ZI. So after doing that homomorphic polynomial evaluation, you'll end up with one of these disks, so like one of the original RLWE plaintext that we started with. Okay, so in terms of cost, the download is only one RLW ciphertext, so somewhat optimal. And for upload, the three things we needed to upload was, one, the indicator vector uploaded here to perform the first layer of PIR, the two packing keys we needed to perform inspiring, and then the one RGSW ciphertext that we needed to perform the homomorphic polynomial evaluation. Okay, so that's InsPIRe, which is our construction that uses both of those primitives that we proposed. But there are also other variants that use like a subset of these techniques, but offer different types of trade-offs. So for example, InsPIRe 0 is a bit faster in terms of runtime, but is limited to only smaller payloads. And on the other end, we have InsPIRe squared, which is the protocol that achieves the smallest communication costs, but it's also limited in that it can only support like up to medium-sized payloads, and it won't be efficient for larger payloads. And in contrast, InsPIRe is like the most flexible, and it achieves the best trade-off between communication and computation, as we'll see. But it can support arbitrary payload sizes, like either small or big. Okay, so with that, I'll go into the evaluation. So the first part of the evaluation is just for PIR over a 1 GB database. And this shows the communication and computation cost for performing one query over a 1 GB database. On the left y-axis, you can see the runtime, and on the x-axis, you can see the communication cost for that one query. So you generally want to be on the bottom left. So the first observation, and all the red dots denote fetching are for points where you're fetching a small payload of like a 1 byte, whereas the blue points, you're fetching a large payload of 32 kilobytes. So the first observation is that the InsPIRe and all these variants that we propose are unlocking the left side of this graph, which are the solutions that have much lower communication. But the other observation is that for any of the related work, you can find at least one variation, or sorry, one of these protocols that we have proposed that is better than the related work in both communication cost and computation cost. InsPIRe specifically, in this graph, you can see that also offers a trade-off, and that's just a performance parameter that you can choose between the communication that you're paying and the runtime of the protocol, which is actually controlled by the T parameter that you saw in the overall sketch. So this is just a subset of the results, but I invite you to read the paper for more numbers and more examples of the performance of InsPIRe and the breakdown as well. So this next evaluation is about the packing specifically, so more like a micro benchmark on the packing procedure. And in this example, we're packing to the 12 LWE ciphertexts into using the different packing procedures with different parameters. So you can compare these two, the two last columns together because they're comparable in the parameters that they use. And so as I mentioned before, the packing key material that you need is much smaller compared to the packing of the related work called CDKS by Chen et al., where you have about 1/5 the packing key material. But it's also, not only do you need less key material, but it also ends up being faster because of the efficient operations that happen in the online phase that I mentioned, with the online time being about 20% faster. The only caveat is the fact that your work in the offline phase actually ends up being a little bit more, which you can see in this case, it's about like 3 times more offline work for the packing. Okay. So then the last part of the evaluation that I wanted to show was the use of InsPIRe in one of the applications that I talked about at the start, which was the distributed file system, IPFS. So like I said, across IPFS, we showed how to model all of the different queries using PIR. And because all of the queries at the end of the day were just some sort of database fetch. So there's generally 3 types of queries in IPFS: the peer routing, the content discovery, and the content retrieval. And these span the different dimensions of databases that you have, either a small database, medium database, or a large database. And in that paper, we showed how you can use some of the existing PIR literature to do those queries. But in this work, we showed how using InsPIRe, you can achieve a much better improvement by using the correct variants of InsPIRe in each protocol. You can achieve a large improvement in terms of both communication costs and computation costs across all the different query types that you perform in IPFS. So yeah. So if that was interesting, you should definitely check out a demo that we've made of InsPIRe, similar to the one that I showed at the start, which is PIR over Wikipedia. We curated a Wikipedia database and performed PIR over that database using InsPIRe as the backend instead of the existing work. And you can see that you won't need the same setup phase that you would require with so many of the related work. So with that, so that's all I have. I discussed, or I presented PIR with server-side preprocessing. I introduced our new techniques, inspiring and homomorphic polynomial evaluation, and the resulting PIR constructions like InsPIRe. And I also presented our evaluation, but definitely check out our paper on ePrint and the demo. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions.